So whenever you hear people talk about additives in wine, you probably picture some modern chemical shortcut, right? But what if I told you that for thousands of years, almost all wine has been, well, manipulated? The history of what we put in our wine is way older and honestly, a lot stranger than you might imagine. Let's get into it.
All right, let's just jump right in with a question. What do you think the ancient Romans put in their wine? Seawater? Ash? What about lead? Well, the crazy answer is all of the above. And figuring out why they did that? Well, that opens up this incredible story about the 2,000-year battle to keep wine from going bad.
You see, for most of history, making wine wasn't just about letting grapes ferment. No, it was this desperate fight against nature to stop that wine from turning into vinegar. And winning that fight, it took some serious ingenuity and a shopping list of ingredients that would make a modern winemaker's head spin.
I mean, just look at this. We're talking about a culture that literally ran on wine. The Romans were making it on an industrial scale. But a lot of it wasn't great quality, and they always had two massive problems. How do we keep it from spoiling after a few months? And how do we make the cheap stuff taste a little better? Their solutions were creative, to say the least.
And what's so fascinating is that they knew what good wine was. You've got this writer, Columella, saying back in 65 AD that the best things are the ones that are just naturally good on their own. He was talking about the ideal of natural wine. But he was also realistic. He admitted that was a rare luxury. The wine most people were actually drinking needed a lot of help.
And here's the thing. The Romans weren't just randomly tossing stuff into their barrels. Not at all. They developed this incredibly systematic approach, like a blueprint, using specific additives and techniques to control everything from a wine's acidity to how clear it looked.
And this was their toolkit. It is just wild. If a wine was tasting a little flat, they'd add gesso. That's calcium sulfate, to brighten it up. Too sharp and acidic? No problem. Just toss in some marble dust. To make it sweeter and last longer, they'd boil down grape juice into a syrup, often in lead pots, which, yeah, leached lead into the wine. They'd add seawater for a bit of body, ash for minerals, even oak galls for tannin. And to make it clear, they used egg whites, milk, clay. You know, some of those are actually early versions of fining agents that we still use today.
It wasn't just about what they added, though. It was about the tech. The Romans absolutely mastered long-term storage with these terracotta containers called amphora. They'd line them with pitch to make them waterproof and keep oxygen out, then seal them up tight. In these things, a good wine could last for decades.
But then, the Roman Empire fell, and a lot of that advanced knowledge just vanished. For the world of wine, this kicked off a kind of technological dark age. All those sophisticated techniques the Romans had perfected, basically gone.
And the biggest change was the switch from those nearly airtight terracotta jars to the wooden barrel. Now, barrels were great for moving wine around, but for keeping it fresh, they were a huge step backward. Wood is porous, it breathes, and that means it lets in wine's number one enemy, oxygen.
And the difference was just stark. Roman storage could keep wine good for decades. But in the Middle Ages, using these leaky wooden barrels, most wine couldn't even make it 6 months. It was a totally different ballgame.
The result of all this was massive. Wine basically became a seasonal product, like fresh fruit. You can actually read chronicles from London's markets where a new Bordeaux would sell for a high price in the fall, but by the time spring rolled around, the price would just tank as everyone scrambled to sell it off before it turned to vinegar.
So for centuries, that was just how it was. But then we get to the 1700s and things finally start to turn around. A few key innovations came along that finally solved that ancient problem of preservation. And they really set the stage for the wine we all drink today.
This whole comeback was really driven by three game changers. First, fortification. People started adding brandy to barrels of wine, especially for long sea voyages. It bumped up the alcohol and made it way more stable. Second, better glass bottles. Using coal for fuel meant hotter furnaces, which could make dark, thick glass that oxygen couldn't get through. And third, the hero of the story, the cork, which gave them a truly airtight seal.
And when you put those three things together, the strong bottle, the tight cork, and sometimes the fortification, you get the perfect package for aging wine. For the first time since those Roman amphorae, wine could be kept for years, letting it develop all that amazing complexity. This right here, this is the birth of the modern wine cellar.
So the technology was finally there, but the actual science, the why of it all, was still a complete mystery. Nobody really knew why grape juice turned into wine or why it went bad. It was all just trial and error. But that all changed in the late 18th and 19th centuries when science finally walked into the cellar.
It really comes down to three brilliant French scientists. First, you had Lavoisier, who figured out the basic chemistry. Sugar turns into alcohol and carbon dioxide. Simple enough. Then, Jean-Antoine Chaptal took that chemistry and applied it, writing practical guides for winemakers. And finally, the legend himself, Louis Pasteur, proved it wasn't just a chemical reaction, it was biological, caused by tiny living things called yeasts.
And Chaptal's name lives on in this process, chaptalization. It's just adding a bit of sugar to the grape juice before fermentation to bump up the final alcohol level. Why? Because a higher alcohol content makes the wine more stable and kills off the microbes that cause it to spoil. It's a perfect example of using science to solve a really old problem.
But it was Pasteur who really connected all the dots. He famously said, "In my opinion, it is oxygen that makes wine." He was the first person to truly get that oxygen has this double life. A tiny bit helps wine mature and develop, but too much of it will ruin it. He started treating oxygen like a tool that you had to manage very, very carefully.
And of course, you know his most famous invention. Pasteur came up with this revolutionary idea. Instead of dumping a bunch of chemical additives into a beverage to keep it from spoiling, what if we used a physical treatment? His process of heating, which we all know is pasteurization, was really the first major push to use physics instead of just chemistry to make our food and drinks stable.
Okay, so let's put it all together. The work of scientists like Lavoisier, Chaptal, and Pasteur didn't just make winemaking a little bit better, they completely revolutionized it. They built the foundation of modern winemaking, turning an ancient, unpredictable art into a reliable science.
This whole journey has this incredible rise-fall-rise pattern, doesn't it? The Romans get to the top of the mountain with their technology. Then, all that knowledge is lost for 1,000 years. The 18th century starts the climb back up with new tools. And then finally, 19th century science gets us to the summit by explaining the how and the why of it all.
And that long, often chaotic history of adding everything from seawater to lead has led us to where we are today. In places like the European Union, what you can and can't put in wine is strictly regulated by scientists and governments. It's the final chapter in a 2,000-year-long quest for control.
Which brings us to one last thought. For pretty much all of history, making a stable, drinkable wine has required some kind of human touch, whether it was the Romans adding marble dust or modern winemakers adding a bit of sulfate. So, after 2 millennia of us tinkering with wine to make it last longer and taste better, what does it even mean for a wine to be truly natural? That's something to chew on with your next glass.